So, a couple of weeks ago, I started seeing this article making the rounds on the political side of the internet. Here's a couple of example of Reddit links here. If you frequent the political side of Reddit or places like it, you likely know the one that I'm talking about already. This single Substack post rocketed to the top of, for example, the r/chaotic goods subreddit and several others at least a couple of times, and was cross-posted across various resistance and lefty political subreddits shortly after that. It has thousands of likes and shares on Substack as well, and has made it to the top of Reddit multiple times. And when I started asking around about it, it turned out a lot of people I knew said they were hearing about it from their friends and relatives. I'm going to go through this article in question, and I'm going to try and approach it from two angles. I personally am a terminally online political person who stares at stuff like this all day, and this article set off my curiosity for sure, and also, shall we say, skepticism from that direction. But I'm going to try and do as much of that as I can using the part of my brain that hasn't been poisoned by decades of working in politics, and just talk about the red flags that you shouldn't need any sort of quote unquote expertise to recognize. Frankly, I think the most important part of this video is going to be right at the very front, where I'll try to show that there's enough obviously wrong with the premise and construction of this post's argument that you're welcome to sit through the full analysis if you just love my melodic nasally drone that much. But you don't have to, because I think there are enough obvious reasons to simply not believe this article basically after a pretty quick skim. Developing a generalized bullshit detector is much easier and much more important than developing a homegrown plutonium-fueled micro-precision nuclear bullshit destruction system for every article that you come across. And so I'm going to front load this video with a few simple clues that suggest this article's claims are extremely dubious, that will hopefully be helpful in quickly evaluating similar arguments like it that you will obviously be seeing inevitably again in the future. And then, after hearing those, if you find yourself sort of down the rabbit hole and want to hear about why the details are just as dubious as kind of the 30,000-foot view, well, you're welcome to stick with me. The article in question is called "The Machines Were Changed Before the 2024 Election. No One Was Told," with the subtitle, "A Private Lab Quietly Altered Voting Machines Used Across the US. Then It Vanished." The author is called Dissent in Bloom, an investigative independent journalist, capital I, capital J. So the headline and subheader of this thing obviously are quite provocative. The author is telling you the 2024 election occurred using, quote, altered voting machines from a company that, quote unquote, vanished, and that it happened in secret. So that is quite a pitch. Just scrolling up and down on this thing before diving into the actual arguments and substance, there are some, shall we say, structural issues with the piece. Right there at the top of the piece, they put something in a block quote that isn't actually a block quote from anything. There are some words out of order. A candidate is referred to by her first name when clearly her last name would be how you would write something like that. Later on, there's a quote Democratic that isn't capitalized where it should be. Across the piece, the structure and formatting really kind of bounce around, with the text changing size and face in kind of a wacky way that makes it disorienting to read. How it looks right now is kind of how I felt trying to read this thing. Again, this is someone trying to convince you that 2024 election outcomes were apparently unreliable because they were run on, quote, altered voting machines, with a belief that extraordinary, it's got to be brown M&Ms all the way down. There's a lot of stuff on the internet, and I think we need to be honest that if someone claims they have secret information about a stolen election, but they don't run spell check before posting their claims, you are actually allowed to express skepticism of the seriousness of their argument before you have read it. That is not an ad hominem, that is just having a filter. Even as I'm just kind of breezing through this thing for an initial read before diving in, that paragraph that I highlighted contained a factual error that jumped right out at me. In the second sentence, they claimed that, quote, in some of the counties, people where voted, again, you can see some of these weird word choices going on, where people voted overwhelmingly for the Democratic candidate Kirsten, that's meant to be Kirsten Gillibrand. Kamala Harris got no votes at all. In New York County, where the Democratic nominee got 0 votes. Now that's a crazy claim, and later on we'll see what they were actually trying to refer to, but did erroneously here. But on its face, the smallest county in New York State has about 5,000 people, and the biggest county, or quote-unquote borough, which I'm told is a term used by people in New York City, I wouldn't know, I don't go to places like this exotic quote-unquote outside place, has several million. If there is a county where Kamala Harris got 0 votes in a blue state like New York, that would be a wild finding indeed, but it isn't true. In 2024, Harris's weakest performance in New York State was about 26% of the vote in Wyoming County, and Trump's weakest was in New York County. I'm told that for some reason, New York was also referred to New York County as the quote borough of quote Manhattan, but I'm not really familiar with street lingo of that kind. But there are 0 counties in New York where Kamala Harris received 0 votes. Furthermore, there are obviously 0 counties in New York where Kamala Harris received 0 votes. Counties are pretty big geographies, with our nation of 350 some odd million being divided up into about 3,000 counties, a little more. So those types of areas are generally too large and have too many registered voters for it to be plausible for a major party presidential candidate to receive 0 votes in a place like that. For example, in 2024, the smallest county in the country, according to the most recent census, which is Loving County, Texas, did not even provide 0 votes to a major candidate, even though that area overall is politically quite lopsided. I think to the eyes of the typical reader, this claim of a county where a major party candidate received 0 votes should immediately raise some alarm bells. It would have been really noteworthy in November if it were true, and frankly, it obviously is not. Later on, we will dive in and see what they actually were attempting to refer to, but a typo of this kind is quite odd for the scale of the claim that they're making. Let's get back to the actual claims of the article. The paragraph that I just discussed is bookended by 2 other key observations the author is using to build the case that voting machines used in 2024 were tampered with. Above, it references sworn legal affidavits of voters, quote, claiming they had voted for independent Senate candidate Diane Sar. So let's be clear what this article is actually talking about. The embedded image associated with the link all across social media, where you've seen it on multiple platforms, the pictures that actually appear alongside the link to the story that went viral across all these different places, clearly features Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, but the actual legal affidavits the article is going to end up focusing on are not about Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. They discuss those 2 candidates slightly in the sort of legal case itself that we'll get to in a moment, but for the most part, the key focus is on independent Senate candidate from New York, Diane Sar. So we're not actually talking about Harris versus Trump here for the most part. We're talking about vote totals for a different candidate at a different level of office entirely. Let's keep that in mind. According to this article, referring to this independent candidate, Diane Sar in New York, quote, 9 people said they voted for her. The machines recorded 5. In another, 5 claimed to vote for her, but only 3 were officially counted by the machines. Okay, so there's some sort of legal action going on here that centers around 4 plus 2 missing or lost or erased or something votes in New York State for a Senate race, not the presidency. But this paragraph doesn't actually link to the affidavits in question. They just kind of say it with no citations, but I'm sure they're around here somewhere. In the paragraph that included the incorrect counties claim, I also noticed that they claim Kamala Harris either underperformed or, quote, seemed to disappear from the top of the ballot completely. So what does that mean? Is this article implying that the option of Kamala Harris was not present at all on some people's ballots? What does, quote, disappear from the top of the ballot completely even mean? They provide no examples or clarification, but it seems like the kind of thing that if you could actually demonstrate was occurring would really help your case that, quote, the machines were changed. But nothing is cited and there are no examples. Right below that paragraph, we can see some data actually being cited. So let's see, quote, Trump outperformed Republican Senate candidates by 2.1 million votes nationwide in 33 states, over 750,000. Okay, wait, so now we're talking about Trump's national vote share or something. A minute ago, we were talking about missing votes in a Senate race in New York for an independent candidate, a county where votes seemed to, quote unquote, disappear in New York. But suddenly, we're talking about the presidential nationwide, but not in places where the supposed miscounted votes that they just referenced even occurred. Anyway, quote, over 750,000 more people voted for president than Senate, a drop-off that might be normal or might mean votes vanished before they were counted. This sentence by itself should set off alarm bells. This idea that, maybe this thing is normal or maybe my conspiracy theory is correct is not really how making an argument works. show evidence for a claim or don't make the claim. The implication of this writing style reads to me like basically, if this fact strikes you as odd, this theory I'm about to tell you must be true. And again, most statistical facts about elections should strike most people as odd because normal people have better things to do than learn a bunch of election statistics. There's absolutely no reason for a normal, well-adjusted person just, producing this article to have any reaction to this kind of a number other than, is that anomalous? This person that I've trusted so far is kind of suggesting that is, so maybe it is. So the basic idea here is what the author is doing is saying, here's a stat, and if you didn't already know it, it must be an anomaly. And that just simply is not true. Most stats are inherently surprising, simply insofar as it's something new you're learning on the spot, and really have no sense of its profundity or lack thereof. Fortunately, in addition to normal, well-adjusted people, there are also people like me on the internet, and I will just note quickly that parties receiving significantly different numbers of votes at different levels of office is extremely normal. A couple of reputable sources on this matter, links in the notes. A Pew survey found that even among very likely voters, i.e. those who are reliably on the voter file as having turned out in a bunch of recent elections, as many as 1 in 6 will fit their definition of drop-off voter, and a different organization, Sister District, recently estimated that statistically meaningful levels of down ballot drop-off are basically ubiquitous in U.S. elections, occurring in upwards of 80 to 90% of elections, and can typically range in magnitude from 1 to 7% to even potentially higher of that election's total turnout. So a drop-off of 750,000 votes in 33 states, with Senate races where people cast in total 54 million votes for the Republican Senate candidates, aka about 1.3% drop-off for the Republicans in total, is actually apparently pretty normal. Separately, an analysis of actual voter file data, the row-level individual voter results that are available by Change Research, demonstrates fairly definitively that voter drop-off itself did not determine the 2024 election outcome. New voters entering the electorate were also highly crucial to the outcome. Even with all that said, I will also say, in my general experience as a political hack who follows this kind of thing for a living, there actually are plenty of smart and thoughtful people I know who say that the ballot drop-off rate in 2024 actually was kind of high. But no one who stares at this kind of data for a living is looking at that data and saying, well, I guess the election was stolen. They're looking at the data and saying, we've got to make some changes to how we campaign to win in the future. Believe it or not, when you look at this data, the choices in your brain are not actually, was everything normal and hunky-dory, or was the election stolen? The choices also include options like, did your preferred candidate simply underperform? So again, you're welcome to sit here and scribble with me and check out the various links in the notes, but my point is that, look, there's a lot of bullshit on the internet. We've perused just a handful of claims this article makes and found some fishy stuff. Some outright errors, some aggressive and manipulative framing of election results, and frankly, just an insufficient quality of the argument being made for the scope of what it wants you to believe. In my honest opinion, you've got a lot to do in this life, and I encourage you to accept that that's probably enough to close the article and move on with your life. Here in this life, we should be training ourselves to recognize the smell of bullshit so we don't have to spread it around with our shoe to confirm that it is what it smells like. The last thing I'll say about this paragraph specifically before we move on to the legal case itself is that it's one of the few in the article that actually cites evidence for its numerical claims. And what it cites is a MAGA blogger. It cites The Washington Stand in an article touting the electoral prowess of Donald Trump as he outperforms his fellow Republicans down the rest of the ballot. Again, a normal thing that frequently occurs. The Washington Stand describes itself as, quote, Family Research Council's outlet for news and commentary from a biblical worldview, and its articles are just rife with MAGA imagery and Republican talking points tip to tail. And what's amusing is that if you click through the links on this particular blog post, they're mostly just reading off numbers gathered and reported by other folks like those at Decision Desk HQ, which itself is a reputable source of electoral data that, in my view, generally does a good job playing its analysis by the book. So if the author of this Substack article was just looking around for election result data to analyze, they would almost certainly find Decision Desk before finding some random right-wing blog that mostly just quotes them. So for some reason, this, quote, independent investigative journalist research apparently had a starting point or an algorithmic search result feed based in far-right opinion outlets. Again, the numbers they cite are perfectly accurate. It's like if you wanted someone to believe the sky is blue and instead of saying look up, you said, well, Donald Trump would tell you to look up. Just an odd choice to make, and it struck me as odd. But okay, let's get to the case they're talking about itself. I'm sure one of these links will take us straight to it, and this one goes to smartelections.us. This one goes to smartelections.substack. This one, do they not actually link to the case at all? I checked every damn link on this article and I could not find them directly linked to the case at the heart of their argument, which is smart legislation et al. Versus Rockland County Board of Elections, even once. Every link that looks like it goes to the case actually just goes to the landing page on smartelections.us or something like it, which we'll get to. But that's weird. The author seems very confident. The machines were changed, capital T, M, W, and C, but they don't actually link to the thing they're describing, the thing that they found so newsworthy, they wrote this now viral article to show to the world. That is odd. And once you dig up the case, you can see there are clear reasons for this choice. To find the link to the case itself, I went through a paid press release on the AP website, apparently placed by, you guessed it, Smart Elections, which sometimes all capitalizes the smart and sometimes doesn't, and has a political arm or action arm called Smart Legislation. The language of the press release is clear. They talk about the possible violation of constitutional rights in Rockland County, New York. The, quote, founder and executive director of Smart Legislation says, quote, there's clear evidence that the Senate results are incorrect, and there are also statistical indications that the presidential results are highly unlikely. They go on to characterize what's in the complaint, with voters apparently saying their votes for an independent U.S. Senate candidate were thrown out. Then they add an additionally, the presidential election results exhibit numerous statistical anomalies. Keep these side-by-side claims in mind. When it comes to the presidential election, they say that, quote, a statistician determined that the 2024 presidential election results were statistically highly unlikely in 4 of the 5 towns when compared to the 2020 results. I'm going to go ahead and spoil the contents of the actual case itself here and say this claim is not actually contained in the legal case at the heart of all of this, and there's frankly a good reason for it. This claim is not based on particularly good reasoning. It's not part of the actual case itself, so I'll be quick here because nobody wants to talk about how p-values and statistical significance work. And again, in my opinion, it's totally unreasonable and unfair to demand ordinary folks sit through the tedious exercise of following this kind of claim to understand why it makes no sense. I'm just going to say what this quote-unquote statistical analysis reveals and the issues with it. The file that they link to is written by a guy who says he has a PhD in physics, which is very impressive, except he's out here doing a very stats 101 level of analysis of election results, which is not really a physics PhD's job in most cases. Telling people you had a physicist run your t-test for you is a bit like saying you found the best chef in town on Fiverr to come over and make you a bowl of cereal. Unless one of you was exaggerating, you're both suckers. The analysis in question, which again is a separate PDF linked to within the press release and not the case, generally, overall, mathematically looks fine. I am particularly impressed by this clip art blue arrow they used to point to the word p-value, although that was how I noticed that they capitalized the v in value for some reason, which you wouldn't normally do. But more importantly, the conclusion is wrong. I know that the part of any analysis where the narrator stops to quickly remind everyone of how p-values work is typically the part of the video where viewers begin to defensively induce aneurysms to spare their frontal lobes of tedium, so in the interest of your anterior cerebral artery, I'll be quick. The p-value associated with the drop-off estimate suggests that the level of Democratic drop-off from 20 to 2024 is statistically very unlikely. That's correct, but the reason that it's correct is because, just to complete the sentence, it is very unlikely if you assume that they were both generated by the same data generating process, i.e. that the 2020 number and the 2024 number are drawn from the same distribution. That's not a bad starting point, as election outcomes are indeed highly correlated. But the fundamental assumption that grants meaning to this p-value is a null hypothesis of basically Dem performance in 2020 and 2024 should be the same. And then what the test is doing is telling us what is the probability of observing the difference we observe if that hypothesis were true. And I hate to bring it to the Department of Physics over here, but Democrats did not do as well in 2024 as they did in 2020. What a world it would be if they did. Indeed, constructing the statistical test this way is tantamount to saying, assume my hypothesis is of enormous statistical interest compared to an assumed null distribution of potential election outcomes we already know did not happen. Literally, what this analysis has done is recover the fact that Democrats did not do as well in 2024 as they did in 2020. By this reasoning, any election in which anything changed from the previous election is, quote, highly unlikely. But like I said, these claims are not actually contained in the legal complaint at the heart of all this. The legal complaint is asking for a recount of the votes cast in the November 2024 general election in Rockland County, New York. Along with smart legislation, the plaintiffs include a couple of voters based in Rockland County and the independent Senate candidate in question, Diane Sarr, the LaRouche Party candidate. The LaRouche Party candidate. The LaRouche Party candidate. The LaRouche Party candidate, Diane Sarr, the LaRouche Party candidate who met her husband at a 1988 LaRouche Party campaign event, whose top recommended reading is a book by Lyndon LaRouche. I've linked to the petition in the notes so you can read the whole thing, but again, it is missing quite a lot that the Substack post and even the press release contain. There's nothing in here about Kamala Harris receiving 0 votes in any geography. There's nothing in here about voting machines being tampered with. Indeed, the argument it does contain relating to down ballot drop-off contains a contradictory argument to the one in the analysis linked to in the press release. They actually show that down ballot drop-off in this case from Donald Trump to the Republican Senate candidate in New York was larger than the drop-off differential on the Democratic side, whereas the analysis cited outside of this petition in that press release fixated on the observation that year-over-year drop-off for Democrats was higher in 2024 than in 2020. Considering that smart elections put their name both on that press release and on the petition, it should raise your hackles that they're telling you that it's evidence of election fraud when Democrats underperform and evidence of election fraud when Democrats overperform. This lends to the general feeling these folks started with a conclusion and simply decided that everything that they see is consistent with that conclusion, even when they are obviously diametrically opposed. And by the way, in the text of the petition where they say vote switching is unlikely to explain these levels of down ballot drop off, they're probably right. People can simply just not vote for the next person down the list. We've seen plenty of data to suggest that's a totally normal thing for people to do. For Diane Sarr's part, there are additional claims in the petition such that she has, quote, sworn affidavits of more voters who said they voted for her than votes for her were recorded in the election. In the county's 39th election district, this is New Yorker for precincts, by the way, they're talking about precincts as far as I can tell, which I think is what the Substack post meant to refer to when they said counties earlier in our read through of all of this stuff. She says she has affidavits of 6 supporters for only 5 recorded votes, and in precinct 62, she has statements from 3 supporters for 2 votes, and wait. Let's go back to the viral post itself. There it is claimed the discrepancy is 9 voters against 5 recorded votes in one district and 5 voters against 3 recorded votes in another district. Neither of these are actually what is stated in the petition. The post says that there are a total of 6 unaccounted for voters. The petition says there are a total of 2 unaccounted for voters. These are the people lecturing you about how your tax dollars should be helping pay them for their hard work doing recount stuff. By the way, at the bottom of the press release, they link to the actual exhibits that show where the discrepancy came from between the Substack post and the petition itself, and it is not at all the case that the Dissent in Bloom post made up any of these numbers. In this regard, I'm not saying that. The Substack post clearly used the counts in these exhibits rather than the actual petition the Substack is talking about. According to the documents roster for the case, these were simply filed after the petition, so presumably they just found more of Diane Sarr's, quote, neighbors to file affidavits. But that same batch of documents also includes another 4 affidavits from, quote, miscellaneous precincts not cited in either the Substack post or the petition. Ultimately, the growing pile of affidavits here means that neither the petition, nor the press release, nor the blog post are working with the same count of sworn affidavits, and there are no documents I can find affiliated with either the case itself, the press release, or the blog post that settle the actual count. Again, each of the counts I'm discussing here has some basis in at least some of the court documents. I'm not saying anyone is making up numbers. There is a way to recover each of them from the available exhibits, but trying to square all these claims is really giving the impression of a pretty slapdash effort for a claim that seeks to overturn an election. We can't agree on how many voters we're actually talking about. Going back to the petition, Sarr further says that she was able to uncover these discrepancies, quote, simply by going down her block and asking a few neighbors. Now, that is, in my opinion, an improbable statement for a candidate who received 0.29% of the vote in her home county, i.e., where about 1 in 300 of any randomly drawn neighbor will have actually voted for her. But I also noticed that she slightly understates the nature of the stated task at hand. She says she simply strolled down the block to ask her neighbors for affidavits, as one does, but got those affidavits from voters residing in precincts that are on the map, completely separated from each other by several other precincts. Midpoint to midpoint, the precincts are just under 2 miles apart, as the potato is potato gun, with the walk along the roadmap looking to be quite a bit more work indeed. I appreciate the commitment to getting in the steps, but also the extreme good fortune with which one can simply go out for a walk and happen to encounter 9 supporters of a party that, in the grand scheme of things, barely received a handful of votes statewide overall. And that's kind of it, really. There are 22 key points in total in the petition that you can go ahead and read, link in the notes, but ultimately the petitioners use these claims to demand a recount and also to provide, quote, open access to all voting and election information as provided by law. They suggest a bunch of ideas for how to verify and count election returns. More on those in a few minutes. You might know where I'm going with that. And of course, they want to be paid for all this hard work that they've done. And by the way, just to go back to their other claim, in case you couldn't guess already, when the petition states its version of the drop-off vote percent that they found anomalous, they use the calculation of drop-off percent that unintuitively inflates the size of the drop-off. If you look up the vote totals they use to make that calculation, displayed here, they calculate drop-off as the percent of within-party votes, rather than simply drop-off votes as a percent of the votes cast, so that instead of answering the question, what percent of voters are drop-off voters, they're answering the slightly different question of what percent of voters dropped off their respective top of the ticket, assuming no split ticket voting, which in practice roughly doubles the apparent percent drop-off that they find. This is like when you get a 50 on that math test and beg the teacher for a do-over on which you get a 55, and you would rather tell your parents that you improved by 10%, aka 5 over 50, rather than your score went up 5 points, aka 5 out of the actual total of 100. It's basically that logic at work here. Again, the numbers in the petition are accurate. I think everyone is, above board in that regard, but they're reporting a slightly less intuitive version of a statistic to exaggerate its magnitude. But ultimately, that's what's actually going on in this petition. A Senate candidate, 2 supporters, and a friendly advocate are saying the 2024 election results need to be retabulated because they have affidavits gathered under, the circumstances that they're claiming, and a level of down-ballot drop-off that, in the grand scheme of things, is neither unbelievable nor in favor of the candidate whose win they are claiming to, quote, call into question by these results, because the magnitude of that drop-off is actually in Democrats' favor when compared to the Republicans, whereas in other places, like in the press release, they raise questions about situations where the Democrats underperform relative to the Republicans. So let's get into the cases that they cite in the press release where they say that there are situations where Kamala Harris received 0 votes in precincts where the Democratic Senate candidate did actually get votes. Both the Smart Elections press release and the Dissent in Bloom Substack post point to quote-unquote districts, aka precincts. Lord, I can't wait till this video is done, and I'm longer after I've used this uncouth New Yorkerism to synonymize the two, where Kamala Harris received 0 votes, despite Democratic Senate candidate Kirsten Gillibrand receiving many. Snopes has already covered this, and this article has got some traction already by itself. But in short, they explained that yes, there are in fact precincts in Rockland County, New York, where Kamala Harris received 0 votes relative to several hundred for Kirsten Gillibrand, and that this is an artifact of how Hasidic communities commonly vote as a bloc and have for a long time, including in elections where Republicans have lost, and the outcome is not apparently in dispute, linked in the notes. I will readily admit I actually find that level of vote coordination quite astonishing, but I do so every cycle. For example, the precinct level returns in 2020, where several precincts in this area did precisely the same thing as this press release is pointing out now. You can see for yourself in publicly available data in an election where Democrats won. There are in fact a bunch of these, and they're in the exact geography Snopes is characterizing and that the press release references. Rather humorously, Smart Elections PhD physics sidekick said this outcome would require, quote, extreme sociological or political causes, and indeed it appears to quite clearly have just such a cause, as the data repeatedly show over multiple cycles where either party won. Again, don't trust a PhD physicist to handle actually difficult questions. Let them stick to PhD level physics and other simple tasks. Leave the t-tests and the map trawling to the rest of us. So, while all 3 of these documents, the petition, the press release covering the petition and the Substack post referencing but failing to cite the petition have in common the argument that the election results were in some way fabricated. The actual connection between them is pretty thin. Each of these documents basically contains different counts of disputed votes. Each has their own different and, in two cases, contradictory version of a drop-off calculation that they claim is suspicious. The Substack and the press release talk about zero-vote precincts, but for some reason this did not seem relevant to the actual case at hand. And independently, none of them makes claims that are particularly compelling on their own. Each has their own uniquely uncompelling statistical analysis, which are neither unremarkable in the historical context or outright are not showing what their physics PhD thinks that they're showing. A couple of them just don't know the history of the area that they're talking about. And I think the petition does the overall set of claims no favors with its rather glib characterization of how the LaRouche candidate party voters' affidavits were gathered in the first place. So altogether, the case is incoherent, and individually, these various key pieces are, shall we say, underpowered in terms of the confidence one can place in their findings. Oh, and also the Substack post claims the nation's election machines were hacked. On the original Substack post, the author, after everything up to this point, actually pauses to offer a disclaimer that the rest of the post, quote, does not reflect smart elections. These are findings from the EAC, unquote, referring to the Election Assistance Commission, a government commission with the smallest imaginable role in elections administration, but that is for some reason another main character in Descent in Bloom's story, quote, found independently by DIB after learning of the lawsuit and reflect this publication only. Okay. Interesting choice to add this disclaimer after you've already said a bunch of inaccurate stuff on the petition's behalf, but here we are. Now let's be crystal clear about a couple things before we get into the specifics of this part of the claim. This post talks about how the EAC, quote unquote, approved changes to voting systems, but the EAC is an advisory body whose recommendations, as far as I can tell, place absolutely zero formal constraints on the rest of the election auditing system, which occurs across state, county, and in many states, precinct level cases, auditing, testing, observing, and monitoring of any and all election equipment occurring across these different levels. In practice, there are in fact thousands of de facto and de jure election auditing bodies spread out across the country, up and down the many levels of our complex federalist system. And for some reason, this article chose to focus on the one with the least formal authority and the fewest responsibilities to make the argument that no one has that authority or those responsibilities. For example, to the contrary, the New York State Board of Elections has its own process that runs separately from and parallel to federal and county and precinct level election administration practices that includes, per the publicly available information in this regard, holding any software in escrow by the state so that it can be timestamped and audited before being used, on-site testing, re-examination, decertification, and, by the way, hash checking on every machine to verify there have been no changes in software that everyone in the testing procedure up and down has not signed off on. So when the Substack post claims election software is, quote, not subject to any independent external oversight testing and, quote, lacked any public-facing explanation, no backup, no outside review, no built-in decertification process, that is all to a word not correct. You might not know this if you thought only the EAC had anything to do with election administration in the United States and no one else, but this person claims they are an investigative journalist. It is not plausible that they are actually that ignorant. By the way, if you look at the updated list of documents in the filing system for this case, a recent document uploaded in mid-July contains a detailed 9-page explanation of the exact type of auditing that happens in Rockland County. Specifically, that includes many of the practices the original petition seems to imply the county currently lacks. So I suspect that behind the scenes, as this case proceeds, these accusations are being, shall we say, litigated and potentially addressed in real time. But to go back to the federal government's piece of this, I'd note that the EAC is composed of 2 commissioners chosen by Democrats and 2 by Republicans, and 0 of them by themselves by the president, who can accept or reject nominees provided by the Senate, but does so only after the U.S. Senate has unanimously approved them. So a conspiracy theory that requires the EAC commissioner's involvement requires you to believe Bernie Sanders, Ted Cruz, Mitch McConnell, and oh, by the way, in the case of when 2 of the nominees were chosen, Senator Kamala Harris, to have all acted together to cost Kamala Harris the presidency. Again, these are facts that an actual investigative journalist would know. The specific claim here is that the companies approved by the EAC to sign off on changes to voting machines, quote, quietly approved significant changes to voting systems, and that link takes us to a PDF that summarizes these changes. The PDF contains a table of apparent changes to voting machines throughout 2024, and just spot checking this table, it's apparently designed to look like a government PDF by virtue of logo placement and such, but it is not. It is actually indeed an accurate reflection of the various hardware and software updates the EAC and the companies that authorizes logged. Those logs are, of course, publicly available, included a link in the notes on the EAC's website, even though this article claims they acted deliberately to avoid, quote, public scrutiny and transparency. Meanwhile, they are literally citing the publicly available information that the EAC has provided to them. I gotta say, these updates do in fact look pretty damn prosaic. There's, edits to the user manual, there's new versions of the Dell hardware to replace the old versions of the Dell hardware, there's a new printer, a new bumper for when you ship the thing, yada yada. But even on the updates that I don't understand at all, like, for example, whatever is going on in this one, both this PDF and the publicly available EAC table it cites contain a full audit of what this update is actually doing. The supplemental audit reports do indeed contain language like, quote, no additional testing is required, but also, quote, all test artifacts, revised code, revised TDP, trusted build, and generated hash values of trusted build were submitted to the EAC for review. In other words, not only does the EAC have any and all updated software, but it has a crystal clear audit trail with mutual hashes of each new version that, at least in theory, filter out non-trusted versions of any code from going anywhere, from being deployed or doing anything, as well as the ability to pinpoint when and where any such code came from, which again, an actual investigative journalist steeped in this stuff would know. At the top of the PDF, the Substack post cites, I noticed that the logo of the, quote, U.S. Council for Accurate and Secure Elections led me to a .org, not .gov, despite how the name sounds, website that I can only describe as a mess. Take a look for yourself, but when it comes up, it's basically a half dozen different donate buttons interspersed with occasional links to download various PDFs of, quote, election recommendations and the like that I definitely am not putting on my computer. The top of this PDF also mentions it was, quote, reviewed by Rick Weibel. According to others who have looked into him, Rick Weibel is a, quote, Republican Party operative, quote, one of the Midwest's most prominent election deniers, who ran for South Dakota State Senate as a Republican and seems to basically travel the country trying to get counties to change their election laws and do recounts. And yes, if you look into smart elections themselves, the vibe is really not far off from the same. Their website has a donate button on at least every full scroll through its homepage. Many links are simply that press release again, or news stories about that press release, or a donate button. They have a YouTube presence spanning years, including, I noticed, at least one episode where they have a guest who participated in the crank Republican audit of Maricopa after 2020 in Arizona. It just feels like they've never seen an election they haven't wanted to raise money from the supporters to pay themselves to do an audit on, whether it helps Democrats or Republicans. Connecting the dots across all three key pieces here, the Substack, the press release, and the actual case, the organization that's present in each layer to at least some extent, Smart Elections, is apparently in league with far-right election deniers, cranks, and crackpots who have basically been crawling across the country, trolling election officials to demand an audience and to demand taxpayer dollars. Again, to their credit, Smart Elections fully acknowledges that the actions they're taking could not possibly change the outcome of 2024, and to their discredit, they repeatedly make this litany of bogus claims to buttress their fundraising appeals and bolster their efforts to extract time, effort, and resources from election officials and from their supporters. Plenty of people look at these cases and wonder, what's the harm? What difference does it make if we do a recount for one little U.S. Senate race and one little county? Well, many people involved in all of this are pretty upfront that they aren't looking at one race and one county. Dozens of counties have had to put up with various iterations of this type of complaint being parroted here, and dealing with this sort of petition takes time and resources, while also casting a pall over the election system itself. I would say it is harmful to the long-term health of the republic if some lawyer can simply slap together a petition and impose a bunch of legal fees on a county government. And I think we need to be frank that the people dispensing these claims are not showing much respect to the people that they're directing these claims at. Rather, the marketing strategy for these efforts is run through, in my opinion, with contempt and condescension. The fact that they think they can get away with so many more claims out in their paid press releases and fundraising appeals than they think they can in front of an actual judge should tell you that they have a vested interest in some kind of bait and switch here. And it's hard to overstate how ubiquitous the donate now buttons are across all of these efforts. On pretty much every page where they can get away with it, there is a donation request. And for what? The next generation of extremely dubious election denial efforts run and lead with right-wing cranks who apparently have no problem using these tactics to perpetuate their efforts. It doesn't have to be this way. I wish that my concluding advice was more complicated than don't believe whatever you read on the internet, but that really is the chief takeaway here. Because here's the thing, politicians try to steal elections all the time. The North Carolina GOP recently filed countless frivolous and obviously unfounded lawsuits in pursuit of overturning a state Supreme Court election just this past year. The Trump DHS is currently underway, assembling a national database that will be used to impose burdensome and arbitrary requirements on ordinary voters in the near future. And I shudder to think of how many viewers of this are literally just too young to remember, but we only had the Bush Jr. presidency in the first place because the Republican Secretary of State of Florida at the time had devoted her career to the idea that she could one day trade her career for a mid-level political appointment in the Bush administration. Crucial elections up and down this country are decided by extremely small numbers of votes. The people trying to tell you that elections are fake and can be falsified at will per shoddy reasoning, factually inaccurate claims, and outright bullshit are effectively trying to tell people that civic participation is a sucker's game, except, of course, that they like you to make a donation to their efforts. The grim reality many people such as this type of phobia need to face is that the election wasn't stolen. An objectionable person won. It's going to take a lot of work, not giving up, not living in denial of elections, but work to win in the future. The cranks aren't going to save you. And if you're going to try and tell someone an easy answer to the contrary, at least run spell check on the fucking thing first. Separately, a couple of smart political scientists, Charles Stewart III and Christopher Kenny, have each posted their own very good analysis of the more specific election results related parts of these claims, links below. They're really smart folks who know election math better than anybody, and I encourage you to check those out as well. Thanks for coming along, and have a lovely day.